Welcome everyone to our latest New South Wales Public Libraries collaboration for online author events. It's so wonderful to know that there are library members from across the state joining us for this extra special author event with Richard Glover and General Sir Peter Cosgrove. So sit back and relax. I hope you've got a cuppa or a glass of something in your hands. Let our guests entertain you, and if you have a question, then feel free to add it into the Q&A box. We will cover as many audience questions as is possible, but I'm sure you can understand we've got a lot of attendees tonight, so if we don't get to your question, we do apologize, but we'll do our best. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land which each of us are on. I'm on the land of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast. I pay my respect to Aboriginal elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to other First Nations people. I celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal cultures and languages across Australia. My name is Christine, and I work for Randwick City Library. It's quite clear in the background there. I'm so honoured to open tonight's event. I'd like to invite the wonderful, wise, and very witty Richard Glover to formally introduce Sir Peter Cosgrove and chat about Sir Peter's memoir, You Shouldn't Have Joined... Thank you, Richard, and welcome, Sir Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Christine, and thank you to everybody who's joined us. Thank you to the great libraries of New South Wales for organising this, and most of all, thank you to Peter Cosgrove. There's been so many books written about Vietnam for a start, but here's something that I never realised before. I don't know about you, but Peter writes so engagingly about his work there as a young member of the ADF, and he talks about, this is the thing I'd never realised about Vietnam, how the jungle canopy creates this lid on the jungle that amplifies all the noise. So he talks about the fact that as you're creeping through the jungle, there's this incredible silence that might go on for weeks on end, where every command, every discussion between the ADF team is whispered. And that is then followed by a battle in which there is this maelstrom of sound. You can only be heard by screaming at each other as every bomb, every bullet, the sound bounces off the jungle canopy and envelops the scene. It's such a dramatic way of recording experiences that can only be recorded by somebody who was there and did it. And of course, the glory of this book is he does this for Vietnam, but also for all the other roles he's played in life, from disaster relief to the head of the ADF, and of course, as Governor General. And Peter, can we start with that moment of the noise in Vietnam? Can you describe what it was like to be there?
Well, you just made what hair I got left stand up on the back of my neck as you described that, well, I'll call it a malign cathedral, where you are used to the silence of the enclosure, but suddenly all hell breaks loose. And that's what it was like. But you understood that. I had been lucky in a way in that before I got to Vietnam, I had a few months with soldiers, experienced soldiers in Malaysia. And part of those few months were out in the jungle, but without people shooting at us, because that was a peaceful country, but we were practicing. And therefore, when I got up to Vietnam, and the jungle there was almost identical in many ways, I was that much more attuned to what my experienced soldiers had already discovered. And that is, if you like, the eerie silence of the jungle. And one of the great stressors was, of course, the lack of visibility in front of you was immense. I mean, you might see 5 meters or so occasionally. Oh, it's a wonderful day, you can see 15, but at the other end of that 15 or 5 meters could be an enemy who's detected you and is waiting to open fire on you. So it was that ongoing tension that just ratcheted up the adrenaline, so that with the big loads, the long distance you walk, you might walk for 8 hours a day or 9 hours a day under the canopy, and the fear, you were absolutely exhausted all the time. So you woke up with an exhaustion debit, then you do your job during the day, and then at night, if you weren't on duty, you could fall asleep on ground, not just the bare ground, but ground that was basically underwater during the wet season. You might sleep in an inch of water.
I mean, you write about, you use the military term, of course, but you talk about fieldcraft in those circumstances. Tell us what you mean by fieldcraft.
All the little tricks, all the little learnings, all the little drills and practices that you'd been handed down by warrant officers and sergeants who were training you to be there in a place like that and survive. Silence, of course, the whispering, the fact that you don't make unnatural noises. So here you are trying to clean your weapons because they must be cleaned several times a day with a good strip down cleaning at least once a day. So that means taking it to pieces. Well, you wouldn't ever do that with more than a few weapons at a time out of the 30 men or so that you have with you, so that at any given time there's lots of weapons still ready to go. And therefore, when you're doing that, rostering this, doing it by rotation, you are actually being very careful not to make a metal piece hit another metal piece. And it was that sort of thing which after a while became second nature, but in the interim, you were reminding yourself, do it this way, do it this way. And I think it was what made our soldiers absolutely superior, because by embracing these sort of skills, we did make ourselves very quiet.
I mean, there's a moment which you, in a very humble manner, jump over in this book. It's the moment you get awarded it's the events for which you later get awarded the Military Cross. You say you call them events over several days. Can you tell us about those events over several days and why they led to that huge honour for you?
Well, on one occasion we were patrolling along, that is in a spread out formation, but still within visual sight, each soldier from the other. And we came into a clearing which had been either blasted flat by B-52 bombs or perhaps had been subject to bulldozers, with huge bulldozers with chains between them, and they'd cleared a section of jungle. And we were passing over that, and one of my chaps found where there'd been very, very recently behind a windrow of felled trees, there were marks of where somebody had been standing around in damp ground. And then that person, we estimated, had seen us coming out of the other side of the jungle and had fled. Now, we followed his tracks when he came to the area where he was presumably on lookout, and then we followed his tracks very briefly, and he'd shot through at right angles. Looked like he might have deserted, you know. So anyway, we followed up where he came from, and we came to the jungle again. And through the other side, we saw chaps moving around, very, very at 20 metres, we could just see little movement. So I deployed the chaps into an open formation. We moved forward and forward and forward, pace by pace, sneaking up. It was horrendously tense, especially for the guys up front. And then eventually one of my chaps opened fire. He basically decided this is the moment. So he opened fire. And then it was on for young and old, as the saying goes. And we bounced forward with great aggression, and we captured the bunker system. That's what it was. And there were chaps there, so that was bad for them. Then we, having captured that, we stayed there overnight. The next day, the rest of my colleagues from the rifle company were with us at that stage. So we had a bigger group, and somebody had taken some of my soldiers from the perimeter on a task and left a gap, and I found that gap, and I left a soldier there because I needed to block that gap, and went up to talk to my company commander, who was 30 metres away, and people walked in. Enemy walked in through the gap where we'd left the gap, which was a bad thing to have done. So I raced down there and I got involved personally in the fight, and that was a bit like the gunfight at the OK Corral or something in a Western saloon. Pretty short range and very tense for a few moments. And I was up against a few fellas. We won that little battle, but it came off the back of a mistake. because we should never have left that gap. So I felt double responsibility, and therefore that's why I went down there and thought, well, there's not just the poor lad I've left there, it's going to be me as well. So anyway, over those couple of days, I just thought it was part of the rough and tumble, but later on I found out that was the basis of the citation.
I mean, look, I might go to a question from one of our viewers, because it goes to this, and it's such a good, simple question from Nedra Roberts from Parramatta Library. She's listening through Parramatta Library. Have you ever been frightened while in the military?
Oh, absolutely.
I guess on that occasion, but on others as well?
Yes, I think there is a sort of a minimum level of fear every time you are out where danger prevails. And that's both natural and sometimes it's good. If it sharpens you up, then I think let me have fear rather than overconfidence. Let me have caution rather than a cavalier attitude. So fear is okay. It's what happens when the worst ensues that is the crucial matter. If your fear and your apprehension has made you cautious, and you've tried to make arrangements to meet the possibility of something bad happening, and then it still happens, what do you do now? And that's where you hope that your training kicks in, and you will do automatically things which are needful for the moment. So let me put it this way. In Vietnam, most of what we were encountering was small arms fire. Occasionally you might blunder into mines and that sort of thing. That's terrible, because a mine is without fear. A mine is automatically hidden. A mine doesn't care that it's destroying itself, it destroys you, and it's done its job. So there's no reciprocation of fear in that case. In Afghanistan and Iraq and places where our soldiers have been more recently, there's that higher threshold of fear in that our foe is very adept at bombs, improvised explosive devices, mines, all those sorts of things, which, as I referred to in Vietnam, where it wasn't as prevalent, there it's this heightens that, what I might call ambient fear, that every time you are not in a safe place, it is automatically not just unsafe, but highly unsafe. So, yeah, there's always fear, and fear is healthy, and it's what you do when you have to function to cope with an emergency.
And obviously, this book was published before the Brereton inquiry came out with all its shocking revelations. But it is interesting you talk about, you compare your own experience in Vietnam with the experience of people who've gone on just repeated tours of duty to Afghanistan over this 20-year period. You say in the case of Vietnam, maybe it was quite common to have 1 or 2 tours, maybe 3. In Afghanistan, people are having 7 and 8 tours. I wonder if you think, and you're quite critical of that in the book, I wonder if once Brereton had come out, whether that is part, I mean, obviously there's nothing that excuses what allegedly happened, but is the way we proceeded part of the problem?
I don't know. So I'm theorising, and it was very much when it was written in 2020, the book, the armchair general. I'd become an armchair general, but I guess I'm still a close observer, and I worried about the frequent deployments. I see it, and you know, the numerate people in the audience, you're all numerate, will know there's a thing called a sine curve, and the sine curve has a set wavelength, and in that you can see that there's a peak and a trough and a peak and a trough. I'm saying that we want the youngsters to be on the peak every time they're away in a very dangerous place. The adrenaline levels must be high, the fear factor must make them sharp, but there is a degrading effect of that. And it means that you psych yourself up to be at this high point of exposure to danger. And then you come off that when you come home. And then you hopefully will recover to a level of normality. That's the bottom of the sine curve, but the bottom of the sine curve is probably normal life. You try to get reacquainted with mum and the kids, because these are mostly men we're talking, or all men, I think, who are in trouble. Or if you're one of the women we have over there, whoever your partner or your loved ones are. So now, then you get warned to go again, and you even know how long it will be. So you start climbing that mountain again, and you leave your loved ones behind a bit. So I think that's very wearing. Of course, while you're over there, each time you go, you say, well, I'll be the person coming home. I will make it back home. I'm not going to die here. So there is an effect, and it's different for what we asked our people to do in World War One and World War Two and Korea, etc., even Vietnam. Let's take Vietnam just as a very single example. You went to Vietnam, but you went for a year. And while you're away, you're at that high point, but then you'll get respite. Very few people went back a year later. And the threats were different in Vietnam. I talk about the jungle and sneaking around. That will be enormously challenging. But every time in Afghanistan you went outside the wire, outside the safe compound, by helicopter or vehicle or on your 2 flat feet, outside the wire, so to speak, is the threat. And you may not see it, because it might be buried in the roadway, or it might come from a sniper's rifle 800 metres away. These are the sorts of things which are on everybody's mind in a war zone like Afghanistan.
Yeah. How was that day for you, though, when the Brereton inquiry came out? Because I think, my feeling was the whole nation was, even people who had nothing, who had no connection like you, none of the love for the ADF, felt this great sense of shame.
Oh, absolutely, and so did I. The thought that any of our people had crossed the line. And I think what Brereton was saying, and I can understand this, is that, there may be repeated tours, but that gives nobody the entitlement or the expectation or the excuse to cross the line.
And of course, the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of SAS people did the right thing.
Absolutely, thousands of them. Well, in the Special Forces community, several thousand over time. That might mean one person 7 times. There's 7 times of a meritorious visit to Afghanistan, but we're told by Brereton there's a small number who didn't just do the wrong thing; they did an egregiously wrong thing, a criminal act in any code of law around the globe.
Yeah, with no excuse of the heat of battle. I think that was the thing that that really shocked people. Can we talk about the big pattern of your career? Because it's so interesting. There's all these moments when you say in retrospect it nearly all fell apart. There's one moment where you later learn that the selection committee for you to go to Duntroon in the first place, to be an officer and all of that, they argued the toss over you.
Oh yes, well I've read the files, and I've probably buried them under 6 feet of dirt now, just so nobody else will see them. But the files quite clearly said that when the selection committee were voting on my candidacy, whether I'd be accepted or not, it was split into the negative. You see, if it remained split, I would have been out, not selected. But the chairman of the selection board came in and said, casting vote, he's selected. And that bloke was the commandant at Duntroon. And I have a feeling that certainly in my first year and probably into my second, he was probably thinking, what have I done?
You only got to see the file, of course, because later on you became the commandant of
Duntroon. Yeah, Richard, yeah, it was ridiculous. I mean, I arrived in there and, by now I was a fully polished, urbane, well-accomplished brigadier. And here I am at Duntroon. And my young staff officer, who was a fantastic young woman, she's now a Major General, said to me, she was in a captain. She said, of course, one of the things I should tell you about is the archives. In the archives, the archivist obviously sees all the files. The only other person who can go up there anytime and see any file that is needed to be seen is you, the commandant. I said, I wouldn't be interested in that, Catherine. I wouldn't be interested. Later on, Richard, that day, I was walking past the archives and I dropped in. And the archivist said, "Oh, Commandant, good to see you." And funnily enough, he had my file on a viewing desk. I thought, "Oh, I'll have a little look."
Impossible not to.
Yep. And I opened it up, and it's a thick file. And the sheets that recorded my various summary punishments, these were minor punishments, cascaded out onto the floor, not just 1 or 2 pages, page after page. And I can tell you, I was after them like a man who dropped his pornographic magazine in a bus shelter.
Oh.
This is that's one chance event. You because of this guy, you get there. The other thing that really surprises me as a non-military person is you say with a lot of conviction and sincerity that you imagine after you've had the job at Duntroon, that's going to be the end of your career, that you'll be tapped on the shoulder. And I don't think I realized that that's really quite common in the military. You rise through the ranks, and then in most cases, you stop and you're very politely told it's over. And that was your expectation.
Oh, yes. And that pyramid, so to speak, gets narrower and steeper. And the climb up may be down to talent, it may be down to luck, it might be just down to the circumstances of when a top job comes along and where you are. As it turned out, one of the jobs that I might have aspired for, given my left or right arm for, cropped up partway through my time at Duntroon when I was the brigadier, the commandant, and due for certainly 2 years, probably 3. At the end of the first year, I was on Christmas leave, and I was given a phone call to say things have changed. The commander of the 1st Division, that's a Major General, is being posted to New York to be the military attaché to the Secretary General. And I thought, why am I being told this? And in the next breath, the guy says, "And you're to replace him on promotion." It was the job that had been inscribed in heaven for me, and I loved it.
Yeah,
and of course,
one RAR.
No, 1st Division. Oh, no, promoted to Major General now. I've got 12,000 soldiers. So I loved it, the command job. So I'm going to train people. I'm going to get them ready for operations, and it's going to be so now. Here I am, I've got up the pyramid near the top, and Timor comes along in the 2nd year when I had a sort of 20 months of command. And blow me down, if Timor had occurred the other side of the new year, that is in early 2000, I would have finished, and my replacement would have been the person to get the job. So it happened in my last 3 months or so on the job, and off I went.
Okay, and didn't you turn out to be the perfect person for Timor? It was such a delicate operation. You talk about the fact that this is a very important relationship, the Australian-Indonesian relationship. Yeah. They're regarding us as interfering, of course, and it's a very difficult thing to represent the international coalition at the same time as being respectful to the Indonesians.
Well, we had a number of missions given by the United Nations, and they were fairly clear, but they revolved around, of course, providing peace and security to the people of East Timor. I mean, that's fundamental. It did say by any means necessary. So that meant this was the toughest UN mandate that had been issued by them since probably Korea. So in that regard, we were able to expect we could coerce cooperation. But I had another one which was not written by the UN, and that was I thought we could do this job, but I added one which was available to the coalition, which was we should seek in all of this, in doing our job, to minimise the damage to our relationship with Indonesia. So that meant that if there were 2 ways of doing things, both would work. We would do the one which was more repairing of the relationship or neutral to it, rather than one which would give offence.
All the same, you talk about there being these very difficult times where they really don't want to acknowledge you, even later on in your ADF, chief of the ADF role and Governor General role, there's still some marginal tension about you.
Absolutely. There is this issue of if they've absorbed what they considered was an offence or an insult to their sense of honour, loss of face, then you might say, well, you need to focus that. Well, focus it on Australia. They did that. Focus it in particular on this guy who led the peacekeeping mission. And actually, I did get burnt twice in effigy in Jakarta. I know that, but and they had a rather insulting nickname for me. It's what Queenslanders call New South Welshmen when the state of origin is at play. That nickname. They would put general in front of it. That was to emphasise who they meant. But that said, I also think there was, after a while, an acceptance that we did our best to actually do the job, but keep in mind the dignity of our relationship with them. And after the Asian tsunami, when Australia stood up immediately and provided huge amount of money, and by the way, we sent 2,000 men and women of the ADF, aeroplanes and ships and doctors and hospitals and all that sort of. We put them up there as soon as we could get them there. We were the first on the ground from overseas into Indonesia after the tsunami went up. We went up into Sumatra, and we even very sadly lost our men and women in a dreadful helicopter crash in 2005 early on, when all the rest of us had come home and a ship was sent back by me to, the government obviously said, please do it, by me to resume relief operations, helicopter crashes. So I think Indonesians came to understand that this was a game changer. And as a result of that, I was asked to not only go to see the troops, I wanted to go and see the troops we had there, but would I report to Jakarta so they could give me a celebration of the Australian effort, which I did very happily.
And that's an important moment. You talk in the book, Peter, about Australia being energetically compassionate, particularly the relief missions that you've been involved in, both at the ADF and then later on in various roles. Is that really, some people when you say that, say, oh, all human beings are compassionate, we're nothing special. And yet when you look at something like whether it's the RFS or the Asian tsunami effort, it does seem as if we've got some ability here.
I'm sure it is something we can prize and we can talk about, skite about, if you like. I am sure that the Australian people, I do mean energetically compassionate. They don't just feel for people and say, oh, I hope they'll be all right. We say, how can we help? It's not one of these, somebody ought to do something. It's going to be, Australians should be helping. And you look at, we've sent our people all over the world on these urgent humanitarian operations. Floods in Pakistan, I seem to, or Bangladesh it might have been, certainly in the subcontinent. That was after I'd retired, but I was so proud of our people. We went over there in big aeroplanes. It took us, a day and a half to get there, but we were still pretty quick out of the blocks.
Another viewer question. It's a great one, I think. It's from Robin Barnes. She's watching through the City of Ryde Library. The impact of service on marriage. How has it strengthened your marriage? Conversely, what toll has it had? Now, in this case, it's Lynn, but I wonder if Robin is part of a service family too and has seen how challenging it is.
Well, it's enormously challenging. I can report that we're in our 27th home. Now, some of those have been, as I have said to the media, nice digs like Yarralumla and Admiralty House, but there's still moves. There's still reorganisation, disruption of the family. If I was enormously lucky, and you have to be, to chance upon a life partner who just does it for love, and also after a while they tend to accept a sense of duty. There's a cynical old army saying, it's throughout the community, but it speaks about where you have one person who's doing some prominent thing and is identified with an organisation, and then there's the partner doing things to support that person selflessly, ceaselessly. It's called buy one, get one free. And if you say that about a service family, it sort of encapsulates the hope, indeed the expectation, that the Army, Navy and Air Force have, that when the uniformed person is doing their thing, the family will cruise along, or at least stumble along, but basically be the other half of the arrangement. We try to help the families, but inevitably nobody can help a family that's not got one half of the parents there.
Yeah, I mean, but particularly when you become Governor General, Lynn is, you know, with due respect to yourself, she's half the story. When you've got, you know, the Japanese Emperor or President Xi from China or whoever it is coming into the lodge, Lynn's half the story.
She is more than half the story, because I'm very clear that most people thought, oh, he was all right, but she's lovely.
You mentioned all these you know, the 27 moves of house. One of them is there's a move where you go to Great Britain, which I was interested in studying military things. There's a point you go to America, and you say in the book, which intrigued me, you say the Americans were teaching you about the American way of doing things, and then in return you would teach them about Australian military values and methods. What's different? What is our ethos, if you like, and how is it different to that of other countries?
Well, sadly, we're a deeply war experienced community. I mean, fortunately, not end to end. We have had a few breaks of piping peace, thank heavens, and may they continue forever. But where we have gone off to war, we've learnt things about ourselves as a nation, but we've also learnt about warfare, and there is an Australian way. And one of the things I would say that we've learnt, probably at the knee of people like Monash, is to be casualty averse. Not to say, oh no, nobody can get killed, but we will always have our leaders focusing on how's the way to do this and win without a huge toll of lives. And I even mean that about our enemies. If it was possible to get to them in a way which says, don't fight, surrender, it'll be better. So be ferocious in attack, because if you're not, the other mob will be, and you'll be in trouble. But if there is another way even to do it with the minimum bloodshed, that's a good outcome. And I think all our officers are imbued with that. Whereas in some other cultures, and I'm not going to be specific about nations, there is a sort of a confrontationist approach. You just have at them until they surrender or they run out of men and you've still got some.
I mean, one of the traditions supposedly is a different attitude to hierarchies than you get overseas. It's often, you know, depicted as the Australian officers the Australians in the First World War refusing to salute the British officers. Do you think that's true, or is that just an Australian myth?
There is more of an egalitarian attitude even to this day between officers and the troops. I wouldn't overplay it. I mean, when you're sneaking around the jungle with them for 5 weeks without a break, and you smell like them, you're tired like them, you get the prickly heat like them, you are as disreputable looking as they are, and they might call you skip, they might call you boss. If they're still calling you sir, you're worried, right? It means you haven't quite been accepted. So, I would go, and even when I was a 4-star general, the chief of the Defence Force, I knew if I went to speak to a great group of Army, this is particular to the Army, this attitude, and I was talking to them, I'd be sir this and sir that. And then about halfway through, some bloke could call me skip or boss. And from that point on, you'd know you'd cracked the ice.
Well, talking about sir, how did it feel when you were a real sir, when you became Governor General, of course, the honorific, very unusual honorific in Australia, only a handful of people still have it.
Yep.
How does it feel in this tradition, and particularly for somebody like you, I think, who can talk to everybody and who doesn't really, I don't think you're one of those people who rests on formality particularly. How did it feel like carrying this handle to your name?
Well, I've been carrying handles to my name since I was 17 and sworn in at Duntroon to be a staff cadet. From that point, I stopped being Peter Cosgrove. I started to become Staff Cadet Cosgrove. That's the lowest rank you can get, by the way. So with that in mind, I've had titles all the way along. When I left the military, I kept the honorific general. At the back of my name, I'd put retired. And why did I keep that? Well, it was just a point of reference. So people would say, oh, that bloke. But I did about the knighthood, what I did when I was retired from the military, hasten to say to people, they say, what do we call you? Say, Peter. And when I got the title, I knew that there could be some controversy, but my intent was to say, well, let's make it clear. It doesn't make me a different person at all. So, I mean, the full handle was a mouthful. I became His Excellency, the Governor General of Australia, the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, and then a bunch of post-nominals. And when some poor person said that at a mayoral reception in Gundagai, the first thing you'd say, well, thanks for that. My name's Peter, right? And you'd want people to relate to you. So it became almost an incentive to try to put people at their ease and not get wrapped around the title on around the flagpole on titles.
Yeah, well, I mean, you obviously saw a lot of people. This book is not a boasty book at all, but you do say, look, this is how many community events we went to. This is how many speeches Lynn and I gave. This is how many Australians we met. You were very keen to have that as the marker of your Governor Generalship.
But I was also keen that people understand that's what the Governor General does, not just me. My predecessor, Quentin, did that. Those sorts of things. I do that. I'm sure apart from COVID-19, that's what David Hurley and Linda would be doing as often as they could. You want to be busy. You want not to sit in some ivory tower waiting for a constitutional duty to pop up so you could sort of put down the pina colada and go and attend to your duties. You use the opportunity you get to go out into the community as often and as widely as you can. There will be other duties that the government asks you to do, a lot of the overseas trips. I mean, I didn't do any overseas trips that I dreamed up. It was always when the government would say, we think this is a great one for the Governor General, a representational thing. Classic, going to the start of the Com Games, going to the start of the Olympic Games. In each case, only for a day or so, but to cheer on the Aussie team. Watch them march into the stadium, get amongst them at the Athletes' Village and say the whole country's behind you. That sort of stuff. Who should do?
And also when national tragedy strikes.
MH17, when we were bringing the remains of those poor people, 298 of them, back from the Ukraine for all of that reverential care and scientific investigation back in the Netherlands. 38 of those were Australians or permanent residents. They needed to have somebody from Australia there to join the international community in receiving them in a mourning but dignified manner.
I mean, you write beautifully about the Dutch and how well they did that in a way that I think would please any Australian to understand how with what respect it was done. I wonder about, though, when you're not overseas, when you're going to the men's sheds or the CWA or the drought relief concert, or what did you learn about Australia and the nature of Australians by getting? It's a rare chance to spend years meeting so many people.
Well, that's what I thought before I even started there, because I'd had the good fortune to spend a year at Government House as an ADC, and Sir Paul Hasluck was the Governor General I served when I was a young captain. But in those days, the frequency of travel was much, much less. It was considered more unusual for the Governor General to do a tour, so to speak, and the tempo wasn't as high. But with the improvement in both digital opportunities, so you could organise something, you could do it in a day, what would previously take back then a week to organise. So you could fill the program up, and then you'd fly, and then you'd keep busy while you were there. So it struck me that the whole tempo of this gave you the opportunity to a privilege to visit people. You found out that people are cohesive as communities. To go to a Meals on Wheels activity, Adelaide, I won't mention the actual club, in Adelaide, and to find there that the average age of the volunteers was well into their 60s, and you'd think, oh, are you doing this purely because, perhaps you're now a widow and this is a good thing to do? And then you spoke to that lady, and she would tell you she's been doing it for 30 years. Now, 30 years of being a Meals on Wheels volunteer, and that's typical. You might go to Merimbula and find that there's a lady there who's been involved in putting on something cultural in a small town, and she just does it. And you think, we give out medals within the Order of Australia, and we seem to be giving out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. But if you wanted to make a comment, we're not scratching the surface on getting to those sort of people. So I used to see, as Governor General, many hundreds of these folks coming up for recognition, but beneath them there were thousands and thousands doing an equally wonderful job. So it makes your heart sing to know that they're out there. And if you had to pay for their philanthropy, that is their personal sacrifice, there'd be not enough money in the budget for that.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Talk to me. One of the stories I enjoyed so much in the book was as you're leaving the Governor Generalship, you and Lynn go to England, and you've got to, of course, go and do your passing respects to the Queen. And I would imagine it would be an enormously formal scene. But it turns out not to be at all. It's the Queen in the Land Rover and the picnic.
Absolutely. Remember that we'd been to see the Queen on multiple occasions. My first encounter with the Queen, apart from seeing her in 1954 when I was a young fella, was in 1985 when I got a medal from her at Buckingham Palace. Now, that was formal. There were a large number of people being invested. And I was, apart from Joe Bielke-Peterson, who was getting a knighthood from the Queen that day, I was the only other Aussie on the list, and I got an AM from her, but that was formal. But I started to talk to the Queen, have a conversation with her in 2000 when I was back from Timor, and she gave me a medal at Government House in Canberra. And I had an audience with her, and pinch yourself, Peter, you're talking to your actual Queen. And then, it seemed that I thought, well, that'll be it. I've seen the Queen in 2000, how lovely. And then when I became Governor General, I started to see her quite frequently. Knowing she wasn't travelling, each time the government asked me to be in Europe from 2014 to 2019, I would inquire if the Queen would like to see the Australian Governor General. She always said yes. And that meant the conversations became very free and easy, warm, two-sided. It wasn't one of these yes ma'am, no ma'am stuff. It was making points and receiving the Queen's remarks and coming back to her on those. Never about politics, but always about what might be called social movements and international affairs, and what she thought of how the UK was going. But again, no politics. I loved it. So when we saw her in 2019, it was anything other than a formal moment. We had the audience at Balmoral Castle, and I'd been worded up, Lynn and I knew, that there might be an invitation from the Queen to take lunch with the family. And this was not lunch in the dining room at Balmoral Castle. This was to be down in the Glens, where there was a gamekeeper's hut, which was fitted out as a sort of a rough and tumble picnic area. There weren't chandeliers or anything like that. It had been gutted from several rooms inside and made into a long room with a bit of a loo out the back and a sort of semi-kitchen. And there were trestle tables, and they had eskies and Tupperware and stuff like that. And we put out all the stuff, and the royal family, there were, I think, 10 royal family and 11 dogs, something of that order. They pushed Lynn and I out of the way. We're saying, well, we're your guests, so we'll, no, get out of it, you know. So I was allowed to help move a table, and I think Lynn was allowed to put out some cutlery. And when, as soon as that was set up, the family members were grabbing food and sitting down. The only person not grabbing food and sitting down was the Queen. So I thought, well, I'm not going to grab food and sit down before the Queen. So I'm standing here like a pillock, and the Queen roused on me and said, just grab your food, go and sit down. So the 2 chairs left, and I took the one, and the one alongside me was obviously for the Queen. And it was lovely. Yeah, it was about 45 minutes of picnic lunch, and no wait staff. Nobody who was a wait staff person from the castle were down there. It's just the royal family. The dogs got shooed outside. They could run round and round. And we just had a picnic lunch, and we said our farewells to the Queen at the end of that, understanding that when we left there, chances were we would not have a face-to-face meeting with the Queen ever again, because I was already out of the job of Governor General. And yeah, there's no real sense that you're going to pop over to Buckingham Palace and knock on the door and say, hey, we've come for a cup of tea. So, you know, it was quite nostalgic on my part, because I thought I've had a minor brush of history with this woman who is, in my view, the lady of the age in my lifetime. Know of, you know, the Angela Merkels and the Indira Gandhis and the Golda Meirs and the, you know, the Hillary Clintons and all the other people who are, you know, prominent figures, easy to recall. I don't think any of them hold a candle up to Queen Elizabeth.
We've only got 10 minutes left, so I must get to some more viewer questions. I love this one. This is from Joanne Gelston, who's watching through Sutherland Shire Library. What is your best piece of advice you wish you knew when you were younger?
I wish that I knew that I would meet a girl from the Shire, which is my Lynn.
Oh, yes.
Yes. How's that? Yeah, girl from the Shire. No, I didn't get married till I was 27, 28. And, you know, that means now I'm a 74-year-old and I've got young grandkids. So one of the things you realise when you get through your own working life is that the next phase ought to revolve around the joy you can take from your kids as they hit their straps in their middle years and your grandkids. So Lynn and I'm glad I met Lynn, but I wish we'd have met 5 or so years beforehand. And you know, it would elongate the time I'll spend with these marvelous kids.
This is from put on glasses, Richard. This is from Audrey Lynn. What do you think about a war? Is war necessary? Can't there be other alternatives?
There are other alternatives. We've tried every one of them, and I think there is. We should bend every effort to preventing war, from people choosing war. And the only reason there should be armies and the like is that the history of man now goes back thousands of years. And from the time somebody worked out how to hold a club or something, we've been practicing wars at some level or another. And why do I mean that? We've shown the sort of atavistic or bestial side of man, where when we don't get our way, we club somebody or we organise and send an intercontinental ballistic missile at them. It's simply acknowledging, sadly, the frailty of our human psyche, that we we resort to violence.
Mm.
That's why when others criticise the United Nations, I can understand the criticism, but I always say, but thank God for the United Nations. Without them, imagine how many more wars or grave misunderstandings that bring us to the brink of war there would be. We have values that we prize. And one of the Australian values is that we have the freedom to be what we want to be within reason and do what we want to do within reason within Australia. Some of the ways in which we uphold that value is to say, well, you just can't walk in here and take over. Now, we're not saying we're a militaristic society, but we have shown in the past that we will protect those things we value.
What about Vietnam, though? I wonder how you keep in your mind two things, really, which was that there was such enormous skill and bravery by members of the ADF, including yourself, put that on one side, but that I think it's fair to say that most people now see that war through the prism of a brave people defending their own country. How do you hold all that in your own mind?
Look, I think there were attitudes of the day, and I could say that people that we know were extremely bright, and I mean the administration of the United States and the administration of Australia and the other nations that participated there, all of them decided that there was something unconscionable going to happen in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indochina, and we best be there to protect it. So, you know, we were coming from a generation of global citizens who had seen totalitarian outcomes and resisted them and won them. And I think there were perhaps lingering vestiges of that when people said, here's the new threat. And it didn't become a war of national liberation or a movement of national liberation. To the people of those days, it became a war of oppression and a war of imposing an unwelcome regime or ideology on other people. So you could just travel that forward. It just shows the imperfection of human nature. So, of course, with 2020 hindsight, we are now so friendly with the Vietnamese. They are amongst our new, strong friends in Southeast Asia. Thank heavens we are aligned and we have got over difficulties of the 60s and early 70s.
Mm. And what a great job they've done with COVID, among other things, as yep. We have, and as the Kiwis have, and as the Taiwanese have. The world, you know, 4 countries with world-class figures. Just let me finally ask, you know, I'll try to squeeze another couple of questions, but one of the things I thought was remarkable, Peter, about your book, if you don't mind me saying so, is that you continually sort of describe yourself as an ordinary person, an ordinary bloke. You talk about some of the other people that you're surrounded with as marvelous intellects, as people of, I think you say, of people of marvelous capacity. You're talking about other people in the ADF and,
yep.
and other people who've served as Governor General. These are all people of marvelous capacity compared to this ordinary person. And yet, when you actually follow the career, I think what's remarkable is that every single job you do, whether it's one where you're expecting to be tapped on the shoulder and shown the door or whatever, you really do seem to have this tenacity and a really fierce desire to do it to the absolute end of your capacity. So I want to know where that comes from.
Well, I don't know how much of it was innate, but what I did discover very early on was that the career I'd chosen, and I thought for a while, very early days, was going to unchoose me, chuck me out for not getting up to the mark, that it became not a career but a vocation. That meant every time I was in a job, I could see that I could do well in that job. I could make things better in that job. If it was a training job, I could help people to learn. If it was a command job, I could look after the men and women, and we together could do above average things. So there was never one of these moments of frustration where I said, oh, it doesn't count anyway. It did count. Even when I thought, well, this might be it. It still counted to me. And I was just going to give it a red hot go.
This idea that you're an ordinary bloke, that's rubbish.
I'm a lucky bloke. My classmates, and I always listen to my classmates. There could be some on the webcast tonight, but my classmates would say I am very lucky. Yes, standing in the right place at the right time. No, but look, luck has got a bit to do with it. But I do think there is this notion that if you feel you've got the skills for the job you're doing, then yes, you can think about what's coming afterwards, if there is an afterwards, but just do this job and do it really well. And if somebody comes up, Job's comforter or a Cassandra comes up to you and says, it's not going to be too good next time, I think you're going to max out on this job, we'll say, all right, thank you for that, and then get on, still do the job you've got. And my wife was very good at that. I'd come home weeping to her, not quite weeping, but I'd say, I spoke to so-and-so today. He said, this is probably going to be it. And she'd say, rubbish. Get back out there.
This is just an old ADF version of cognitive behavioural therapy, isn't it? It's very...
Quite possibly.
Very useful. I think we've got room for one last question. So it's a beauty, though, from Rhonda Wainwright. What moment in your life has been the most significant? That's a pretty good last question.
Yep. Professional moments abound. I can't put it down to any one because there's a lot, and they are great for a particular time of your life. First couple of episodes of combat where I found that I didn't run away, I did my job, and my people got through it, and I understood in the aftermath that I'd been able to do what they needed. That's so much of a relief. Then later on, command jobs. I had an infantry battalion of 750 young men, and they were, in my view, the best battalion in the world. And I had so much joy being in charge of them because I thought, wow, if I didn't do another job after this, I'll always remember this. And then suddenly I'm in Timor, standing on the brow of a ship on the, whatever it was, the 23rd or something of February, the final day when I was leaving, and being cheered onto the ship by East Timorese who had no reason in the preceding number of years to cheer any soldier, and being cheered for the way in which the force had behaved and operated. That was wonderful. Being sworn in as Governor General was, I thought, I've been asked to be Australia's first citizen, and Lynn and I are up for this. That was a mighty moment. But it's the family things. I've got to say that people who are lucky to have loving families will have just this gallery of life's moments. Your wedding day, when your other half accepts your proposal, your wedding day, birth of kids if you're up for kids, their successes, all of those are gold. And that brings everybody back down to the same level. You can't do a more important job in Australia than not the Governor General, not the Prime Minister, but to be part of a functioning family that loves one another and enjoys good health. Then you'll have good fortune.
Well, it's a gripping story that tells us a lot about you and Lynn and about the ADF and about what being Governor General is like. But, I think it's also a book that tells us a lot about the qualities of being Australian and what's important about the Australian experiment. It's a really ripper read for people who are watching. You shouldn't have joined is the title, which is all explained in the introduction. But I want to thank you very much for talking to me so frankly and evocatively. But now it is back to, and thank you everyone for listening and for the questions. But it's now back to Christine.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Sir Peter. It's, oh my gosh, it was such an amazing event, and there's much more to be learned in that book. Melanie, my colleague, she popped in a useful link to buy it from Booktopia. I know many libraries like ourselves here will have many copies for borrowing as well. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry we didn't get to answer everyone's questions. We will forward them on to Sir Peter, and perhaps in another event that they will be covered. But again, thanks everyone for your time, and we're just going to end the event now. Bye-bye. Thank you.